"I'm not the pretty one you ordered," said the bride. The cowboy smiled. "You're all I needed." Jake Thompson had seen his share of rough times, but the empty spaceport on the edge of the colony was a new kind of isolation. Dust settled on the metallic floor, and the distant hum of machines only added to the quiet. Jake wasn't used to waiting, but today he had no choice. The message had been clear. His bride was arriving. The one he had agreed to marry through the distant agency that arranged it. A new beginning, a new life. Or so he hoped. He had imagined someone delicate, someone who could bring warmth to his lonely ranch. He had read the description over and over. A beautiful woman from the prosperous planet of Altera. She would have elegance, a refined air about her, and most importantly, she would be a companion, someone to fill the silence in his life. She was supposed to be a perfect match for him. Jake didn't think much about the details. It was a simple transaction. You ordered a bride, and they delivered. He'd heard rumors, of course, stories of mismatched couples, of people not getting what they expected, but he dismissed those. The agency's reputation was solid. This would work out just like all the others. The shuttle landed with a low rumble, and Jake stood up, brushing off the dust from his worn-out jacket. He glanced at the small crowd gathered at the port, but his eyes kept moving toward the airlock, waiting for her. He didn't know her name, just her description. She would be everything he needed, that's what he kept telling himself. The airlock hissed open, and out she stepped. Jake's heart sank, and he felt an uncomfortable knot tighten in his chest. The woman before him was not at all what he expected. She was tall, but there was nothing delicate about her. Her face, though striking in its own way, was marked with lines that told a story of hardship, more than just the softness of the advertised brochures. Her eyes were a piercing green, sharp and wary, but there was something beneath them, something that reminded Jake of the stories of old frontiersmen, strong and determined. She didn't have the polished, graceful movements of a woman accustomed to luxury. Her clothes, simple and practical, were worn but clean, nothing like the elaborate dresses he had pictured. The moment their eyes met, Jake could see the challenge in her gaze. She wasn't smiling. She didn't seem pleased to be here. In fact, she looked like she was regretting every step of the way. "I'm not the pretty one you ordered," she said, her voice low, with an edge to it. There was no hesitation in her words. It was almost like she had prepared herself for this moment. Jake blinked, unsure of how to respond. He had expected to feel joy, even excitement. But now, standing face to face with the reality of this marriage, he felt unsure. He opened his mouth to say something but couldn't find the words. His hand instinctively reached for his hat, lifting it off his head and scratching his stubbled chin. "No need to explain, miss," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "You're all I needed." He had no idea why those words came out, but they felt true. She was here now, and he would make this work. She eyed him unimpressed. "That's what they all say," she muttered, glancing around the empty spaceport. "They tell me how perfect it'll be, and then they look at me like I'm some kind of mistake." Her words hit harder than Jake expected. This got twisted. He hadn't thought about it like that. To her, this was a forced journey, a lonely path she hadn't chosen. A sense of guilt stirred within him. He hadn't come here expecting a woman to bear all the weight of this decision alone. He had come for a life change, sure, but he never considered how she might be feeling. "I'm Jake Thompson," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. You're here now, and we'll figure this out together." The woman studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Clara." She didn't add anything else, as if she wasn't sure whether to say more or her name even mattered in the grand scheme of things. They walked to the transport that would take them to his ranch. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts. Jake glanced at her now and then, trying to find some way to bridge the gap between them, but Clara's eyes were always focused ahead, distant, as if she was already thinking about leaving. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't help but wonder about the woman who sat beside him. She wasn't like the others he had known. Those who dressed for the occasion and smiled at the right moments. She was different. And though he couldn't exactly place why, Jake felt a strange sense of respect for her. There was a strength in her, even if it was hidden behind a layer of defensiveness. After the long, quiet ride, they finally reached the ranch. Jake's land stretched out before them, dusty plains and rolling hills, the place where he had built his life from scratch. He didn't have much, but it was home. It was his. Clara stood beside him as they both looked out at the open landscape. "You really live here?" Clara asked, her voice softer now, though still tinged with disbelief. Jake nodded. "I do. Not much to look at, but it's honest work." She gave him a quick glance. "Honest work, huh? What does that mean to you?" Jake chuckled, scratching his neck. It means I wake up every day and do what I have to do to survive, and I've been doing it alone for a long time. Clara didn't reply, but there was something in her eyes that Jake couldn't quite place. She was a stranger to him, yet in some strange way she wasn't. Well, Jake said after a moment, this is home. For both of us now. Clara finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. We'll see about that. It wasn't the warm welcome Jake had imagined, but it was a start, a beginning. They would have to make this work, or so he hoped. He wasn't sure what to expect from Clara, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be like any romance he had ever seen before. The storm came without warning, as storms often do on the frontier. The wind howled and whipped across the barren plains, sending dust flying in every direction. Jake and Clara had been on the road for hours when the sky darkened and the first crack of thunder split the air. We're going to need shelter, and fast, Jake said, his voice low but firm. The storm was moving in fast, and there wasn't much time to find safety. Clara glanced up at the sky, her eyes narrowing. How much farther? Not far, Jake replied, though he wasn't so sure. The ranch was a good few hours away, and the storm seemed to be coming faster than he expected. There's an old settlement up ahead. We'll find shelter there for the night. Clara didn't respond, but kept her eyes trained on the horizon. She had been quiet since they left the spaceport, her thoughts distant. Jake wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could tell she wasn't entirely comfortable in this new world. And honestly, neither was he. He had spent years alone on this land, and now he was supposed to be responsible for someone else. It wasn't something he had considered when he signed up for this marriage, but here she was, and now they were in this mess together. As they neared the settlement, the wind picked up, blowing the sand into their faces. Jake gritted his teeth and urged the horse forward, but Clara hesitated. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Clara asked, her voice carrying a hint of doubt. Jake turned to look at her, his eyes scanning the land. The settlement was barely visible through the dust and rain, a collection of old, dilapidated buildings that hadn't seen life in years. He knew it would be their best option for the night, but Clara didn't know that. "We'll be fine," Jake said, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "It's just a place to ride out the storm." They made their way to the settlement, the horses' hooves crunching over the dry ground. When they reached the first building, Jake jumped down and helped Clara dismount. They hurried inside, finding shelter in an old wooden structure that had once been a storehouse. The roof was leaking and the walls creaked under the weight of the storm, but it was better than being out in the open. Inside, Jake started a small fire in the corner, its warmth a welcome relief from the biting cold. Clara stood by the door, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes scanning the room. She seemed uneasy, like she was waiting for something to happen. Jake wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel the tension in the air. "This is it, huh?" Clara said, breaking the silence. "This is your idea of a warm welcome?" Jake looked over at her, surprised by the bitterness in her tone. "I didn't know the storm was coming this fast," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "This is all I could offer. I don't have much, but I've got a roof over our heads for the night," Clara snorted. "A roof? And what else? A dusty old room and a broken-down fire?" Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He could feel the weight of her words, but he wasn't sure how to respond. She had every right to be disappointed, to feel like this wasn't what she had signed up for. He hadn't expected it either. But this was the reality of life on the frontier. It wasn't all shiny spaceships and beautiful planets. It was about survival, and Jake had learned to survive. "I didn't mean for things to be like this," Jake said quietly. "I'm not good with all this. I don't know, fancy stuff. All I know is how to live off the land and work the ranch." "I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Clara's eyes softened, though she didn't say anything right away. She moved closer to the fire, warming her hands. The storm outside raged on, but inside it felt calmer. Not comfortable, but calmer. They were alone in this strange place together, and there was no running from it. For a while, neither of them spoke. Clara stared into the fire, her face illuminated by its flickering light, while Jake watched her from across the room. He wondered what she was thinking. After a few moments, Clara broke the silence again, her voice quieter now. "So, what's your plan after this?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "After what?" "What happens next?" she asked, her tone surprisingly calm. Jake hesitated. "I don't know. I thought I'd bring you back to the ranch, show you around, maybe fix up the house a little. You know, make things livable." She nodded slowly. You're not looking for someone to take care of things for you, are you? To cook your meals and keep your house in order? Jake frowned. No. I don't need someone to do that for me. Clara tilted her head. Then what are you looking for? Why did you want to get married in the first place? Jake sat down by the fire, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Maybe I thought having someone around would make life a little easier. It's been a long time since I've had someone to talk to, someone to share things with. Clara's eyes softened again, though she didn't speak. Jake wasn't sure if she understood, but for the first time since they met, he felt like she was starting to see him, maybe even starting to understand. The storm outside was getting worse. Jake stood up, going to the door to check the winds. It was blowing harder now, and the sky was so dark it was hard to tell what time it was. We'll have to stay here until the storm passes, Jake said, turning back to Clara. No point in trying to head out until it clears. She nodded, though she still seemed unsure. The quiet between them stretched, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been earlier. There was something else between them now, a mutual understanding that maybe things weren't perfect, but they were doing the best they could. As the hours passed, they spoke a little more, sharing stories about their lives before this, the things they had left behind. Clara talked about the wealthy life she had once known, the promises that had been made to her, and the broken dreams that followed. Jake spoke of his life on the ranch, the hard work it took to keep things going, and the quiet loneliness he had grown accustomed to. By the time the storm finally started to subside, both of them felt a little lighter, not happy, not fully comfortable, but less tense, less on edge. They had weathered the storm together, and in that moment it felt like maybe they could weather whatever came next too. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wet dust and a muted sky. The air was heavy, thick with the remnants of the downpour. Jake stood at the edge of the old settlement, staring out at the vast plains beyond. The wind had died down, but it still carried the chill of the storm. Clara stood beside him, her arms crossed as she, too, watched the horizon. They had spent the last few hours making small talk, and though the tension between them had softened, there was still a distance. Neither one of them knew how to bridge that gap, but it was something they would have to face sooner or later. I think it's safe to head out, Jake said, breaking the silence. We'll head back to the ranch. It's not far now. Claire nodded, but she didn't seem eager to leave. I can't say I'm excited about seeing the ranch, she muttered, her voice distant. I've seen the life you live. It's not what I imagined. Jake didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. The life he led wasn't much to look at, but it was real. He had worked hard for everything he had, and he wasn't going to apologize for that. I don't expect it to be what you imagined, Clara, he said finally. But it's my life. I'm not perfect, and neither is my ranch, but it's home. She gave him a quick glance, and for a moment it seemed like there was something she wanted to say but didn't. Instead, she simply nodded and turned away, heading back to the transport they had arrived in. Jake followed her, silently cursing the uncertainty between them. They couldn't keep going like this, both of them walking around the truth without ever acknowledging it. But right now, they didn't have time for that. As they made their way back to the ranch, the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows over the land. The world seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The winds had calmed, and the usual sounds of the frontier, the hum of insects, the distant call of wildlife, seemed to have gone silent. They reached the ranch by nightfall. Jake's heart sank as he saw the lights from the main house flicker in the distance. Something wasn't right. The ranch had been peaceful when he left, but now he sensed a change in the air. Stay here, Jake said quickly, his voice low. I'll go check things out. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Jake silenced her with a look. It's not safe. Just stay here. I won't be long. She didn't argue, but Jake could tell she didn't like being left behind. He didn't blame her. He didn't like leaving her there either, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He moved quickly, heading toward the barn first, his boots making no sound against the dusty earth. His hand instinctively went to the holster at his side, checking the weight of his weapon. He didn't expect trouble, but he had learned long ago to never take anything for granted. The barn was empty, the large doors swinging in the breeze. There was no sign of life inside. Jake moved to the house next, his instincts telling him to be cautious. As he approached, he saw movement in the shadows, figures gathering near the front porch. Jake froze. They were too far for him to make out their faces, but he could tell they weren't the usual hands he worked with. These people had a different look to them. Rough, hardened. They didn't belong here. Jake's fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon. He didn't recognize them, but he didn't need to. He had been dealing with trouble from settlers on the edge of the colony for months now. They had been eyeing his land, wanting to take what he had worked for. He had thought they had given up, but now it seemed like they were back. With quiet steps, Jake moved around the side of the house, keeping out of sight. He could hear bits of their conversation, though the words were too soft to make out clearly. "Take it from him. Get what's ours," one voice hissed. Another voice, deeper and rougher, answered, "We'll take what we can. The woman will be a good leverage." Jake's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what they meant by leverage. They saw Clara as a bargaining chip, a way to force him into giving up his land. The thought made his blood boil. He wouldn't let them get away with it. Jake pulled back, ducking low to avoid being seen. He had to act fast, but he needed to be careful. If he confronted them directly, he might not make it out alive. He needed a plan. Clara was still waiting at the transport, unaware of the danger just a few hundred yards away. Jake had to protect her not just from the men outside, but from the whole situation. This was her new life, and he wouldn't let anyone take it from her. He moved toward the barn, where he kept some old equipment. There were traps, old weapons, and a few other things he could use. He grabbed a rifle and a few supplies, then made his way back toward the house. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady. The closer he got to the house, the clearer the voices became. They were still talking about taking over the land. Jake couldn't let that happen. This land was his, earned with sweat and blood, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it without a fight. Jake crept up behind the porch and crouched behind a stack of old crates. He waited for the right moment to strike. It wasn't long before one of the men stepped closer to the house, just within reach. Jake's fingers tightened on the rifle. He aimed carefully, pulling the trigger just as the man passed. The shot rang out, loud and clear, but it wasn't meant to hit him. It was a warning shot. The man froze, and the others turned quickly, their eyes wide with alarm. "I suggest you leave now," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're not welcome here." The men froze for a moment, then began to reach for their weapons. Jake wasn't about to give them the chance. He fired another shot, this one landing closer to their feet, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Get off my land!" Jake shouted, his voice carrying the weight of years of hard work. For a moment the men hesitated. Then, with a few curses, they turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Jake lowered his rifle and let out a slow breath. His heart was still pounding, but the danger was gone, for now. He turned and walked back toward the transport where Clara was waiting, looking confused but relieved. "It's safe now," Jake said quietly, his voice softening as he approached her. "They won't be back." Clara didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read him. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "You willing to fight for this, for us?" Jake nodded. "I don't have much, but what I have I'll protect. You're part of that now, Clara. And I'm not letting anyone take you or this away." Clara studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'm not sure where we go from here," she said softly, "but I'll stand with you, whatever happens next." The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Jake had spent most of his life working alone, but now, with Clara in his life, things felt different. The ranch wasn't the same place it had been before she arrived. It was no longer just his. He could feel the change in the air, like something was stirring. There was a weight to the silence that hadn't been there before. Jake spent his mornings working the land, keeping his eyes open for any signs of trouble, but he found that his thoughts often wandered to Clara. She had been quiet lately, her usual sharp words softened, though her eyes still held the same uncertainty they had when she first arrived. She wasn't the woman he had imagined, but she was here now, and he needed to figure out how to make this work. He had never been good with people, especially not with women. Clara wasn't like the women he had known before. She wasn't looking for a man to lead her or make decisions for her. She had a strength about her that reminded him of the land itself. She could survive here, just like he could. He wasn't sure if she saw it yet, but he knew she would. Clara was out by the creek one morning when Jake came to find her. She had her sleeves rolled up, her hands busy in the water, but when she saw him approach, she stopped, wiping her hands on her pants. "You're early today," she said, her voice softer than it had been in the past few days. Jake nodded, sitting down on a large rock nearby. "Thought I'd come by and check on you," he said, his voice casual but not without care. He hadn't seen her much the past few days. She had been keeping to herself, and Jake couldn't blame her. This wasn't easy for either of them. Clara looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I'm not sure what to make of this place," she said, her voice quiet, almost as if she was unsure of what she was admitting. "It's so different from anything I've known, but I think I'm starting to see it. The way you live, the way you work. It's honest. Jake felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He wasn't sure what she meant, but it felt like a step forward, and that was more than he had expected. I've spent my life working this land, Clara, he said, his voice a little softer now. It's not much, but it's mine, and I'm not about to let anyone take it from me. Or you. She nodded, her eyes flicking away from him for a moment. I'm starting to see that. You protect what's yours, don't you? I do, he said, his eyes meeting hers. And I'll protect you, too. Clara's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. She looked away, staring at the creek again, but Jake could see the way her fingers trembled slightly. Jake stood up and moved closer to her. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think we can make this work. Together. Clara turned to face him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle rush of the creek and the quiet of the morning air. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice steady but quiet. I don't know what I expected, she said softly, but I think I'm starting to see what I've been looking for. Jake wasn't sure if it was the words themselves or the way she said them, but something inside him shifted. It wasn't love, not yet at least, but it was a kind of understanding, something deeper than what they had started with. I'm glad you're here, Jake said, his voice low and sincere. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe and happy. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, with a slight smile, she nodded. I think I can get used to this. The rest of the day passed quietly. They worked together, fixing fences and tending to the animals. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The work was hard, but they did it side by side, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but companionable. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Jake stood on the porch of the house, watching the land stretch out before him. Clara came up beside him, her gaze following his. It's beautiful, isn't it? She said, her voice softer now, like she was finally starting to understand what Jake had been telling her all along. Jake nodded, his eyes still on the land. It is. It's a hard life, but it's real. It's ours. Clara stood beside him, her presence warm and steady. Maybe that's all we need, she said quietly. Something real. Jake glanced over at her, surprised by the depth of her words. He had always thought of his life as simple, just work and survival. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was the connection they had, silent but strong. Maybe that was the real thing. Maybe it is, he agreed. And in that moment, Jake knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges or struggles they would face them together. They had survived the storm, they had fought off the threat of the settlers, and now they had each other. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to build. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope.